Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to turn things back over to Michelle in just a few minutes, but I just wanted to remind those of you who have entered that you are now in a regular Zoom. This means that if your video and your microphone are on, that we can both see and hear you. If you would like to ask a question and you prefer not to be recorded, you can ask that question either anonymously or in your name by putting it into the chat box. And this will cue our moderator and facilitator, Michelle Gilman, that you would like her to ask the question for you, either with or without your name. Thank you, Michelle.
Yes, but of course you can just ask your question yourself. So just use the raise hand function under reactions and I'll just call on you and turn over the floor to you. So it'd be exciting to hear from you, that's for sure. So Lauren, do you think we should get started? Are we ready?
Yes.
All right. So I want to throw it open to you all who have questions here for Salome. And anything you want to ask is fair game.
So can I take host privilege and ask the next question?
Of course you can.
Great. That was a wonderful presentation and a back and forth between Michelle's terrific questions and you, Salome. My question, I completely understand and sympathize with the need to provide the law with the mechanisms through which to legislate and regulate in the public interest. But I am curious where antitrust law comes into this picture, because it seems to me that in my layperson's knowledge of antitrust law, it was changed radically in the 1980s when it started to move from protecting the public interest by preventing companies from exercising too much power to just protecting consumers. And therefore, if you were offering a quote unquote free service, or if you were supposedly lowering prices, you didn't get into the crosshairs. And so I'm curious what antitrust now offers to the package of what can be done for machine learning and data in the public interest.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's a live question. I was actually on an NYU law panel that was like very law on, it was like all antitrust. And I was like the data governance guy on the panel, not a guy, but like I was the data governance guy on this panel. And so I think it's a sort of interrelation that people are thinking about a lot right now. So you're totally right. I mean, I think there's been like a very fun intellectual revival around the original historical purpose of antitrust legislation, really to deal with like this moment of sort of like profound industrial power consolidation in the kind of robber baron era. And it was all about market power and like breaking up market power and like the Brandeisian idea of like, it's actually distortive to our democratic processes to have such extreme concerted power in things like US Steel. And so we did antitrust law to break up things like US Steel. And then, in the 80s along came Bork and he was like, no, it's about consumer welfare. Like who cares about market power, qua market power? And that's a problem when you tag consumer welfare to prices for sort of indexing the kinds of concerns we might have with free for consumer services like Facebook, or even very advantageously priced services like Amazon, which, because of their logistical efficiencies and potentially first-degree price discrimination that they can engage in, actually benefit consumers, arguably. So that creates a problem. And we're in a moment right now of revisiting in antitrust, like, do we actually want to return to market power? So that kind of intersects with the kinds of questions I'm interested in 2 ways. So one, I think that a lot of the kind of data relations of oppression problems that I'm talking about are magnified by problems of scale. So, you know, I do think we face a problem in that, like, this is being done by enormous companies that are able to exert considerable market power and produce kind of political pressure, both in the US and in they operate globally and are able to exert pressure globally on various governments. So, you know, I think that that's certainly a problem. But I think that antitrust doesn't totally index the kinds of concerns that I'm interested in a couple of ways, or for a couple of reasons. One is that even though the intellectual conversation on antitrust has really moved, the jurisprudence of antitrust is still, like, very much obsessed with this problem of market definition. And the problem with information is that it is, I think, conceptually very slippery when it comes to market definition, because part of what information is as an asset that these companies are exploiting is itself kind of like a asset, or like a stem cell, I like to say. So if we define the market as like hearts and information is, you know, aka advertising, and information is like, you know, a heart, and you can kind of morph the stem cell back down and morph it into like a lung to say, like, okay, if we crack down on advertising, if you have fine-grained consumer behavior data, you just beef up your like credit insurance use of that prediction data, or you beef up start selling it to health insurers, or you start getting into the business of issuing commercial business loans because you have really fine-grained location data and you know what the markets are for various coffee shops on the Upper West Side of New York. So, you know, it's sort of an inchoate stem cell kind of asset that I think renders it very difficult to kind of register in our jurisprudence of antitrust right now, which is all about defining and pinning down a market. That's like a boring jurisprudence answer. My kind of more conceptual answer is that I think, to use the example of Standard Oil or US Steel, which were like the original big antitrust examples, breaking up Standard Oil was good for all kinds of competitive reasons and for the distortions that Standard Oil had on American democracy, but it didn't do anything to address exploitative oil collecting, processing, and use. And so that's how I would draw the neat little analogy. It's a little pat, but you know, we can break up Facebook, which will prevent distortive effects on democracy from the sheer scale of that company, but it doesn't do anything to address the underlying market incentive that Facebook and a variety of other tiny shady actors have to mass extract consumer or user data. So yeah, that's kind of how I would draw the comparison there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one thing I would note is some of the scariest operators aren't big tech. So if you think of Clearview, which has gotten into a lot of trouble for facial recognition technology used without any transparency or accountability, it's a guy with a laptop in a coffee shop, right? With billions of photos and churning algorithms that are being sold to police departments and other vendors. So it's not all big tech. There's some really potent little tech.
Well, yeah, and that's like the, you know, yeah, that's like all the tiny little, you know, people who lurk in ad bid streams and just scoop up all the data and then sell it, like Funware, which was the company that ran Trump's re-election campaign. They were just legally scooping up, well, legally, but shadily scooping up data by lurking in bid streams. And yeah, so there's all sorts of shady actors that are doing data exploitation that don't, it doesn't neatly reduce to the problem of scale.
Right. Antitrust is only a piece of it. All right. So our next question is from Baden. Take it away.
Morning. Thank you so much. Evening as well. Thank you, Salome. Thank you, Michelle. That was a great presentation. My question is about surveillance of people in like really specific professional contexts. So I guess your examples were more about, you know, like consumers and people kind of going about their daily lives and doing things and interacting with these systems. I'm doing a lot of work on professional athlete data in Australia, so like football biometric data. And so I was wondering about, like in the US, this kind of biometric data, is there any specific, do you know about any specific kind of laws around it or uses? Because in Australia, at least in one of our sporting codes, it's sort of used in a really minor way. Mostly it's used for training purposes and performance management, of course. But there's also part of it that's used for kind of fan engagement. So during matches, there'll be like a position data or who ran the fastest, this kind of stuff. But this is a really tiny slice of the data they actually have. So they're producing these massive data sets. I'm not really aware of much use of it outside of that, but I wonder in the NFL, for example, or in NBA, if there's anything like this, or if you had any kind of thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I haven't thought about the professional athlete context, though it makes sense and is so fascinating. I mean, when you asked if whether there's any biometric data law, we have like classic US extremely basic just consent biometric laws. So even those companies didn't bother to comply with. So a famous one here is the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, which basically just requires you to get consent of citizens of Illinois to collect their biometric privacy. Companies didn't do that. So now a lot of the class actions in the United States against Facebook for collecting facial image data is actually arising under BIPA, Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act. I'm not aware, I mean, again, the default rule in the US is that you can collect whatever information you want to, as long as you get people to click a contract, and then you can do whatever you want with it, as long as it falls within the vaguely worded contract you had them click. So I know that the NFL and the NBA have data analytics teams. The NBA's and Major League Baseball in the United States have actually quite robust data analytics teams. They tend to, I don't have firsthand knowledge of whether or not they're collecting very fine-grained athlete level performance metrics, though I imagine they probably are. A lot of that goes into sort of trading decisions and kind of strategic choices that the various teams will make. And I don't know if they are like compiling that in like a general database, like NFL database. And now I'm just purely speculating, so I don't know, but I would imagine that they probably aren't, because a lot of those data analytics teams in the United States are proprietary and they're like very secretive, and they're kind of about like informing like the Yankees trade strategy. So why would they share that information with the Red Sox? Like, I think there are probably proprietary interests that are cutting against like aggregating that information. But again, like the NBA is the only professional sports league in the United States that has it, where the players have a union. So you could imagine the NBA players union saying, no, as a matter of the union, we actually want access to all this information that the data analytics teams are collecting about our players, so that we can see whether or not it's being processed in a way that's fair, or if it's being implicated in payment decisions or trade decisions, that it's being done in ways that comport with standards that the union puts forward. So similar kinds of interests would be implicated there, but yeah, I'm now just theorizing, like just talking wildly about stuff I don't know much about, but the topic seems really fascinating, and I would be very interested to see what comes of it for you.
I'll just add, I was at a work group with a lawyer for the NFL Players Union, and they are profoundly concerned about this and the amount of health and fitness data that they're gathering, including like underneath the turf, how heavy people step on it. I mean, it was at, my mind was blown at the granular level of what they're collecting, and the players are very concerned, and it's becoming an issue in collective bargaining. So reach out to the unions. I'm sure they would, if you're a researcher, my guess is they'll give you an earful about their concerns. And that's all I know, but it was a big topic at this particular employee focused roundtable that I was at. It was super interesting.
Great. Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah. All right, next up, Anand.
I just had to find the mute button. This is a really great talk. So just to introduce myself, I'm in the electrical and computer engineering department at Rutgers. So I'm a technologist, I guess. And so one thing that I see, and things actually that I work on, are these sort of technological fixes, if you like, or approaches to try and put on fixes to address, that sort of try to circumvent the issue that you bring up, which is that, well, why should we collect this data in the first place? And what we'll say is something like, oh, we'll use fair machine learning to make sure that we don't have disparate impact, or we'll use differential privacy to make sure that people's privacy is preserved. I work on differential privacy, so I make this argument, this somewhat specious argument all the time. Or blockchain technology, which is saying, oh, we can assure you of the provenance of various things. And so they all seem, according to your critique, fundamentally flawed in the fact that they don't acknowledge the relationality of the data. On the other hand, like things like differential privacy try to break the relationality, to say like, oh, I'm going to not make it so that you are, in fact, regardless of what other people are, you are going to seem independent or something like that. And so I guess my question is, apart from saying, well, you shouldn't be collecting this data in the first place, what is like what is a good productive way to interrogate the sort of fundamental underpinning, the fundamental like assumptions being made by even approaching problems through this kind of technocratic solution?
Yeah, so it's fun to hear you work on. I've also worked on different, so I worked with a group of computer scientists and lawyers at Harvard looking at differential privacy. So worked with Cynthia Dwork a little bit on differential privacy. And before coming to Columbia, I spent time at Cornell Tech working with Helen Nissenbaum also on questions of differential privacy. So I thought about that a bit, and yeah, and I'm very interested in the US Census's adoption of differential privacy. So yeah, I think that there are a number of these technological fixes that I wouldn't argue are fundamentally flawed. I think a lot of them are actually ways to impose constraints on the types of relations that we're able to materialize via data flows. So oftentimes, if you imagine, you can imagine differential privacy or like a fairness standard actually just saying, excluding certain kinds of data relations from being rendered to begin with. So in that way, the technology is actually constraining or creating a standard or creating a threshold or a floor for the kinds of things, the kinds of relations that we can materialize in the information and the kinds of relations that we can't. You noted differential privacy is a way for us to actually kind of try to break up relations, and we can imagine imposing, setting our privacy budget in differential privacy kind of differently for different kinds of relations or different degrees of sensitivity of information, to be mindful of the way in which we're relating or not relating people. So yeah, I actually am not, I tend to be cautiously optimistic about certain forms of technological fixes. Again, I think that technological and legal controls can be placed on information infrastructures to sort of try to enact political rules. Now, I do fundamentally think that the quality of data relations should be determined kind of politically, democratically, ideally, but we can enact and enforce whatever standard we give for data relations via a mix, and I think we will have to enact and enforce data relations in a mix of legal and technical kind of control mechanisms. So that's kind of abstract, but hopefully helpful. I would not say that I'm a techno pessimist.
Well, I mean, I guess, yeah. Sorry, just as a quick.
Yeah.
I'm not saying like I'm a super pessimist, but what I see, for example, yesterday I attended a workshop run by Google on federated learning, and they were like, oh, we're going to use differential privacy, and so we can have all your data. It's okay that we have all your data. Yeah. We're gonna treat it real good. Don't worry.
Right.
It just sounded like a little bit of a bait and switch, and so that's yeah. What I had a little bit in terms of substituting a technological band-aid on what is actually like a legal an ethical issue that we should be thinking about in that terms, instead of like, let me just use this technology to do it.
Yeah, no, and there I could not agree with you more. I mean, I think that like, don't worry, we'll just post hoc, use differential privacy to guard against a re-identification harm. We're like, well, is the only thing we care about a re-identification harm? Like, I don't think so. So yeah, no, there I'm in wholehearted agreement.
Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So let me just put my hand down. So what I wanted to ask about was the kind of sort of ideas that you suggested at the end of the talk and others about how you might have sort of appropriate shared governance of data. And, I was really struck by your really compelling examples of it, but sort of like, we tend to approach data with a kind of naive sense that it's about people that really breaks down with population level predictions. And so, I guess the kind of concerns that I'd like to hear you talk about is like, you could imagine that, one kind of model for shared governance of data is essentially that people that contribute data to a social network or other service become, in a sense, shareholders that have the right to vote or appoint representatives at high levels of corporate governance. And what's compelling about that is that it is much closely intertwined with the organization of the company and is able to respond to like kind of facts on the ground kind of dynamically. But on the other hand, the weakness is that like when you have this kind of population level inferences, it's not really clear who the shareholder should be anymore.
Yeah.
And I guess that's sort of why you pointed to things that sort of governments could do either at the national level or at the state or local level. But the worry there is that sort of without some effort to kind of combat the power of these, of the companies themselves, as well as the kind of, slow pace and kind of reactive nature of legislation when it can happen at all, that sort of it's a recipe for a sort of permanent game of catch up. And so I just wanted to hear about some more models, and like particularly like the shareholder model or sort of more sort of things that engage the public more directly and the constraints on data use.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very live and interesting concern. So the shareholder model actually brings to mind like another series of proposals that people have right now, which is really imposing fiduciary standards on companies. So which is a way kind of enacting what you talk about as a shareholder model. So instead of, actually granting all of data collectors as like shareholder rights, which you could do as sort of a way to get to a fiduciary model, you could also just say like, if you collect the data of these people, you owe fiduciary obligations to them, which might take the form of having like data subject representatives on the board and constrains you to a bunch of sort of legal roles that we have for entities that are in a fiduciary relationship, so that you'd have a duty of loyalty, duty of, oh my gosh, I'm like blanking on all the fiduciary obligations. Anyway, you have a set of fiduciary obligations, basically not to take advantage or sort of do things that are in violation of the interests of data subjects. So yeah, I mean, I think that the you correctly pointed out that I think we run into like a conceptual problem with anything of that sort that sort of like starts with a data subject and just aggregates its rights, because my whole point is like, well, if we think the interest is actually like in how that information is going to be used, that doesn't only reduce to the individual data subject. And like now we have a bunch of unrepresented interests, which is why I tend to go to like various kinds of forms of public solutions. I think you're right to be skeptical of like legislative, the speed with which legislative action can happen. But again, I think that there are all kinds of ways in which you can intervene at the municipal level with a licensing scheme. You can imagine like public trust doctrine kind of governing information about people, which again are sort of public entities formed in private law, which is a trust law is private law, enforcing and managing collective property interests. So we have things like public trust and public trust doctrines. I mean, you can also just imagine, again, taking my example at the end there with like the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at University of Michigan, like a renowned public institution with people who are experts at curating and managing large data sets of data about people being sort of granted authority to manage under the public mandate they already have to manage information about people in the public interest, information handed over from public media, social media companies, or a consortium of people from the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and the U.S. Statistical Agency offices. Now, those are just then sworn public officers who have to manage that information in line with their public duties, who are subject to Title, in the instance of U.S. statistical agents, subject to very strict confidentiality rules in how they manage information about people, and have professional expertise. There's PhDs in statistics or library science or information science doing management. So, those are sort of like public institutions or public functions that are being managed by experts, being able to exercise their discretion and being held accountable by various professional standards. That doesn't have to go through like fresh congressional review every year. My quippy line on this is that we have the Fed and we have like experts in monetary policy managing the Fed. That doesn't have to go through congressional approval every year. We have a monetary system that functions and disperses a profoundly core public thing, public medium, which is money. Surely we can come up with some parallel ideas and systems for social data. I feel like it's a small ask in comparison to money.
Next up is
the rich people want money to work.
Yeah.
Exactly. Next up is Angelina.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask if you could speak to how you would balance the individual rights-based approach with this sort of collective claim to data analysis, and I guess a sort of socialization of it, and how would you actually balance that when they can be often in conflict with one another? So for example, if somebody wants to opt out from this sort of socialized analysis, if you could just speak a bit to that.
Yeah, so, I think to some extent, in some instances, the social claims are in addition to or complementary to certain individual claims. In other instances, they are, as you point out, perhaps in more direct conflict. So my example of Adam, the global north person being like, I don't want to share my carbon emissions data. That would be very bad for me in a climate reparations scheme. And the Bens of the global south being like, no, you have to share your climate emissions data for us to understand the degree to which you owe us climate reparations. Like, yes, these are people who have interests. They are conflicting. Adam's ability to opt out of that clearly has like profound consequences, and like there's a zero sum kind of either or stake. What I'm saying is like an initial matter is like, we can decide, the law is in the business of adjudicating competing claims all the time. That's like literally what the law is the adjudication of competing claims. But we have to, as an initial matter, like recognize that this is a place where we have competing claims. Like right now, we just don't even recognize that Ben has any claim or interest at all in Adam being able to opt out from sharing his climate emissions data, for example. So that's not to say that Ben wins in every case. Like some cases Ben loses. But as a conceptual matter, we have to say like, okay, clearly there's an interest being implicated here. Now we can go have a back and forth on the merits of those claims or the strengths of those claims to say like, okay, do they rise to a level of being legally justiciable? Maybe, maybe not, probably depends on the situation, depends on the background legal regimes. But I mean, I think the law is enough if in nothing, if not in the business of balancing competing individual claims. So I think, so that's kind of like my weak, like dodgy answer. But I think I want to make like another intervention, which is to say that I think a lot of times what we intuitively understand as like profoundly individual rights to data aren't actually individual. And so the example I use here is have a lot of friends who are pregnant or just have had kids. So we can imagine information about whether or not I'm in the first trimester of a pregnancy. That feels super personal and obviously is very implicated in live debates we're having right now about whether or not I can terminate that pregnancy, or who has a right to know whether or not I'm in the first, it implicates like very real life decisions about me. And I might think that I don't want anyone to know that I'm in the first trimester, that I'm in a first trimester pregnancy. The problem is that if I'm super careful and I don't share any information about whether or not I'm in the first trimester of my pregnancy, I opt out, I say no, I don't share that information with anybody. Because of the population level kind of features of data, if another party, an interested party, wanted to know, was very interested in knowing whether or not I was in the first trimester of my pregnancy, they could, with a great degree of accuracy, predict that by just placing me in population level relations. Okay, what sort of purchasing activity am I making? Have my coffee habits changed? All of that, by sort of placing me in population categories and making inferences about me on the basis of the behavior of others that share features about me. And so that feels like a super personal thing. But what I'm saying is that, like, in reality, that is not under my control. I want it to be under my control, but it's kind of a false condition that it's under my control. And so that means that if I don't want anyone to know that I'm in the first trimester of my pregnancy, that interest actually accrues to the law saying we can't know, it ought to be illegal to know anything about whether anyone is in the first trimester of their pregnancy. And like, that's a sort of a solidaristic, like, I'm in that together with everybody else who also has an interest in their first trimester pregnancy data. And that's just kind of like true. It's unfortunately true in how the data economy works.
Right. And that's a great example. Janet Vertese at Princeton tried to keep information about pregnancies, invisible. It's absolutely not possible. She has her own, like, she went to the length
it's
of,
not possible.
it's not possible, having her own like servers so that her data didn't even pass through other servers. It's impossible. It's been tried by someone with a high degree of technical capability. So
Right.
yeah, great example. All right, next is Lauren. Just unmute yourself and you'll be all set.
I was going to defer to Boren.
Well, you can certainly do that. So Boren, why don't you go, then we'll go to Lauren and then back to Anand, who has another question.
Zoom raised hand. Thank you so much for the paper. Thank you so much for the talk. This is one of those, I don't know, papers that feels extremely thought-provoking and so rich. I wanted to invite you to say more about the challenges you encounter once you do this like huge lift of setting the stage for us to think of data governance as a collective governance problem, as a democratic governance problem. And earlier, in the, like right after the talk, you mentioned, the pressure points you find especially interesting, thinking about operationalizing this, thinking about like where on the ground in the law can we start pressing to see change happen. I'd be curious to hear your take about like what do you see as the difficult challenges or the places for like, helpful contributions at the boundary between questions about collective data governance and normative theory. I'm really thinking like the stage in the paper where you go to, like discussions of, equality, where you go to discussions of recognition and concerns like that. Like, I'm just like curious to hear like, what's your take on points for like helpful contributions for that direction or things that are especially challenging? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the question actually that, is it Angelina asked me, who I think she just said she has to run, I think touches on like a very deep philosophical quandary that is like very alive, which is like, how do we balance, in a liberal system or a liberal society, and like unfortunately all of law in the US just presupposes on liberalism, so like that's the paradigm I'm in. Like, how do we balance legal, like individual rights and individual interests against collective rights and collective and social rights, collective and social interests? Like, I'm not going to probably solve that question, that problem. Like, theorists have been hard at work on that one for like 3,000 years at least, but I do think that, again, I think of like data relations as sort of just materializing in digital form, our social relations. So all of the problems that obtain about negotiating the claims I have and the rights I have as an individual versus the obligations I owe to society as a result of me being a member of society are here and they're live. And we don't usually think of ourselves as data governance scholars as being in the business of negotiating those boundaries, but unfortunately we are in the business of negotiating those boundaries. Also, again, I think like because of how data production happens, I think where those boundaries are drawn in data governance law, I try to make and argue the case, are far, currently like far overprotective or over inclusive of individuals in a way that I think don't actually even, again, as my answer to Annalena tried to say, like, even if all I cared about was myself as an individual and how information about me can be used to make decisions about me that undermine my autonomy, like, unfortunately, I feel scary to admit, like, that just doesn't reduce to a contractual relationship in law. Like, it's not the kind of thing that is subject to what we call private ordering in law, which is where, like, I consent on behalf of myself. Like, unfortunately, we find ourselves like in a situation where like I'm consenting on behalf of others all of the time and others are consenting on behalf of me all of the time. That, to me, and as a legal scholar, is not the kind of relationship that is appropriately ordered via private law, via the laws of contract and property. They are appropriately ordered via our public legal regimes, aka our law of the polity of democracy, of the way that we negotiate our collective obligations to one another. So I'm not answering your question. I'm just like re-articulating it. But again, I think this is where, I mean, the paper started as a political philosophy paper and it like slowly and painfully morphed into a law paper. So I think, where that leaves us is precisely in the set of debates right now happening in moral political philosophy about democracy and about democracy as a political institution that gives force to the moral fact that we are moral equals. And so what that means is that we like recognize our mutual obligations to one another because we are moral equals, and the political systems that give force to that are democracy. And so when I talk about democracy, I'm not talking about like institutions that aggregate votes. I'm talking about, Iris Marion Young says like democracy is the condition of standing in equal relations with one another. So democracy is like the standard of equal democratic relations. Our like equal data relations are democratic in that way. So anyway, yeah, I'm happy to talk further about that, but like that's where I see myself plugging into like philosophical conversations, is really in that conversation of like relational egalitarianism. I want relational egalitarianism for data relations.
That is a perfect segue. Thank you, Borhan, and thank you, Salome, for the answer to lead up to the question I wanted to ask, which was exactly about political philosophy, which was
all right.
one of the things I used to do before I became a critical AI person. So I find it really, really interesting. Now, of course, I understand completely why your paper morphed into more legal theory. You need to be able to make arguments in the spheres that might be able to take action. Nevertheless, I'm really struck by just how deeply individualist and atomized individualism, not just individualism, but atomized individualism is the predicate for what you are calling liberalism, which, as we know, back in that Brandeisian tradition that you're talking about, in fact, back as far as John Stuart Mill, when people were still sort of making this stuff up, the citizen was not atomized. The citizen is always, first and foremost, part of and responsible to a social body. And that's not socialized in what I think was what Angela was trying to say about the model that you are putting forward. That is the notion of the public, which is the subject of a democratic republic, right? In other words, not an aggregate of individuals, but public interest, which is to say not an atomized ontology. So I feel as though what the atomized individual predicate does is to start the argument hobbled in the sense that one of the things that we can't fully acknowledge is that the minute that we begin having our data expropriated and extracted, and then saying that there's some symmetrical version of this where we want to be legible for data, we're already acknowledging ourselves as being atoms that will not be legible unless we can have a subjecthood in data. And I find that a really bad asymmetrical trade-off, right? I mean, as citizens, and believe me, I understand that this does not help a lot of undocumented people. So it's not like 19th century political philosophy is the answer to everything, but certainly as citizens, we have the right to be legible. And that doesn't have to be a datafied legibility. So what I feel is being a little bit lost in your analyses of the necessary trade-offs between positive, affirmative data subjecthood and the negative kind, leave me alone, is that datafication is already an atomizing, expropriative process that already makes us lose as citizens of a democracy, already turns us into atoms, even if we're atoms with rights. And we can demand legibility without consenting to having to have datafied legibility. And just to give you a sense of what I mean, now I don't think of this, but I'm putting it into the chat box. This is how Jathan Sadowski defines what data is when it's been datafied.
Yeah.
The recorded abstraction of the world created and valorized by people using technology.
Yeah, I've actually spoken at great length with Jason, been on his podcast a couple of times, wrote actually my little piece in Nature behind me, wrote with Jathan and Meredith. So yeah, Jathan and I have had a lot of conversations about subjecthood and data. I think part of what I'm interested in is actually like a little bit pushing back on this idea that the second we're rendered legible by digital systems, we're atomized, because I think what I'm very interested in is that we are, but also a lot of what gives that atomization meaning is actually non-atomized, is relational. Like I'm legible via data systems, not as Salome qua Salome rational subject of the law, but as like a pastiche of social features. Like I'm a redhead, I'm a millennial, I'm a woman, I'm a cat owner, like I live in the Upper West Side. Like these are all facts about me, but they're also facts that I share with other people. So in fact, they're related, like they make meaning out of me by making meaning out of me in relation to all of the other people that also share that feature with me, which also says meaningful things about me because it said meaningful things about them. And so it's sort of like a population level dialectic relationship that's now being kind of like rendered via flows that I'm really interested in, because again, for me as a legal scholar, like it's like this like epistemological clash between what we theorize as the subject of law, which is this like rational, liberal, autonomous being, and this very behaviorist subject of computational systems, which is actually precisely like not particular, like there are very much ways in which that's not atomistic. I am understood as the composite of my relations with others. And that's what's so endlessly fascinating to me, actually, as a legal scholar, of thinking and writing about these systems. So I would not contend that currently the way in which we're being subjectified in into information flows isn't harmful, but I do want to hold open space, particularly in the US legal regime, where we're steadily dismantling the right of the state via our court system, via our extremely conservative court system, steadily dismantling the right of our state to be anything other than a carceral state. So insofar as we want a welfare state at all, a state that gives as opposed to a state that simply takes, that is going to require some form of being, or democracy, yeah. Like I totally agree with you that not all the ways in which we need to be rendered legible can be datafied or should be datafied. But some of how we want to be read, I would like us to preserve in the law the capacity for some of the ways in which we're rendered legible to the state to be datafied. And by that, I mean sometimes often like very basic things, like, for example, our pandemic relief. I have good friends who are Norwegian, and how they got their pandemic relief is that they their government like sent out a little form, and you were like, I need money, and you like sent in your little like I need money to the government in the morning, and by that afternoon your money landed in your bank account. How did ours happen? You had to like first prove you were a human and not a citizen, and that you didn't make too much money, and you had to submit your tax reimbursement, and then like 7 weeks later, for me at least, this shady looking thing that looked like it was a predatory lending scheme showed up, and it was like a debit card that had like the wrong amount for me, right? As like my pandemic relief, like it came 7 weeks late on this like scammy looking debit card. Now, that's a story of an information flow. Norwegian citizens are legible to information via data flows. Their state has access to link them as a citizen of Norway to a bank account number. Their IRS has that bank account number. The agency responsible for dispersing funds was able to link to that data set, to link that person to a bank account number, to a tax reform, and to send money from that like ping that said like I need money to that bank account. That's a data flow. I want us to be legible in that datafied way to the state, so that our state can do things like give us direct monetary transfers at the moment people need them, and not act like some people aren't literally living hand to mouth and can just casually wait for 7 weeks to get their money. So is that the only way that citizens should be legible to the state? Absolutely not. Is that a way that I would like us to preserve in the law, the ideal that we could be rendered legible to the state? Like, yes, I am. Yeah, so that's hopefully a partial engagement and response.
And imagine my clients who don't have bank accounts, who bank in the informal alternative financial marketplace, so they can kiss their financial support goodbye. It never came. All right, Anand.
Yeah.
Actually, this is sort of then relevant since we're talking about money. And I can't take credit for this question. My partner, an anthropologist over here, asked the question, and she's listening in on the conversation. But so her question was actually, doesn't the credit score somehow do this to us, but it's at a slower time scale, but also kind of is doing kind of the same thing. And in some sense, how is the credit score different than, obviously it's maybe it's being done by quasi official actors and not like Facebook, but so that's, I guess, a difference, and it's at a slower time scale maybe than I'm getting served an ad for gun smoke flavored soap, which is what Facebook decided to advertise. I don't know why.
Yeah.
Yes, you
So-
do.
No, the credit score is doing this already. The difference is that it is not many of the companies engaged in credit scores are not subject to any kind of public accountability or oversight. They literally use all of the information that they can get about you to make credit score decisions about you, like even like your phone chart, like how good you are at charging your phone is meant to be an indicator of how good you are to pay back your credit risks. And yeah, it's happening. It is happening. It's just happening in the private market, not subject to public accountability or oversight, and with various kinds of the sets of incentives that govern the private market, which is to say profit maximization for the various actors involved. So we're already doing it. It's just private. It's private market governance as opposed to increasing kind of democratic control or oversight over those systems.
I guess the point is,
yeah,
it's
go ahead.
And so therefore it's kind of, is the problem presented, how are the new problems presented by sort of the new technologies fundamentally different from the fact that the credit score is also problematic in the same way, right? It's, I guess, a kind of question of like, because the credit scores existed for decades. So it's like been around determining whether I can rent an apartment or anybody can rent an apartment, et cetera.
Well, the construction of the credit score is actually pretty recent. The types of information it uses to construct a credit score is recent. The legal controls we've had around what information may viably be used in a credit score and what can't have steadily been eroded. potentially entirely struck down by the recent Supreme Court opinions, unclear. So, I think there's a variety of responses. I mean, I would say that, again, I think for me, analytically reorienting the view of data governance scholars to data relations is not to say that credit scores haven't always been a problem. We can imagine that I would say that credit scores aren't a problem because I would say credit scores were a problem before they became datafied, and they're a problem now that they're datafied. The reason they were a problem before they were datafied is that we are allocating many core things that people need to like live and flourish via a private market, which is maybe not the way that we want to allocate access to things like education and housing and food. But we're privately financing them. And so for that, we need to do things like credit risks. Now, we are now rematerializing in various data relations, existing financial relations that we may have found incorrect when they were being done largely in analog form, but now they're in data form. So the same reason that we might have found analog credit social relations to be problematic, we can just sort of port over to the reason that we might find their datafied form problematic. So that's a long way of saying that credit scores are wrong for all kinds of reasons. Those reasons also apply to them in digital form.
And for the 26 million people who are credit invisible, that's no joy either. So yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
All right. I thought that Kathy had a great question here. I don't know if I should just read it out, Kathy, or if you want to take the floor.
Thanks so much, Michelle. So my question, and first of all, Salome, thank you very much for what's been an incredibly engaging and thought-provoking session.
Yeah,
my question is around how collective data governance intersects with infrastructure and infrastructures very much in the Bowker sense of data infrastructure and critical data infrastructure.
Yeah, I think one way of materializing claims to data relations are as claims to data infrastructure. And public data infrastructure. So very closely related, very intimately related. Again, yeah, Jathan and I have actually talked about that. So yeah, I think it's spot on. And again, I think once we recognize data flows as infrastructural, that's one way of rendering very legible the kinds of collective interests and stakes we have in doing certain things with them, not doing other sorts of things with them.
Please chime in with other questions or comments as you all mull all this over. A lot to think about.
Yeah, I saw a button, your phone never charges Spire. That unfortunately, that means that you're getting dinged on your credit score.
It hasn't affected me yet, unfortunately, but yeah, it's just a technical issue. But I guess it brings up a question of like, causality and correlation with these data sets. But is it true that Michelle, you're talking about 26 million uncredited people in the US? Is in Australia, everyone has a credit score of 0, I guess, to start with. We don't have to get debt to kind of get a credit score. Is that different in the US? Do you have to kind of get debt to be able to be good?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
you
and
have to
again,
engage with mainstream financial institutions.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And again, I mean, I think for me, or what I find really interesting about that is like that only becomes such a big problem of equity and access because we premise the allocation of so many core goods and services on the credit score. Like the example I like to use, because I used to be a health economist in the UK, is like, in the US, like, okay, we allocate healthcare privately. We could just decide to give universal healthcare, and then you wouldn't need a credit score to access healthcare because it's just a publicly available good. But because we basically allocate more or less everything on the basis of private allocation of that good, that means that having a credit score is hugely important to access all kinds of things. Now, we don't have to premise the allocation of core goods and services. We don't have to allocate those things via a private market, but as long as we're allocating them via a private market, a credit score is incredibly important. And again, here, I mean, again, like maybe like showing my radical politics here, but like, I think what's wrong with like the datafication of credit scores isn't like, oh no, we only used to collect analog forms of data. And like now we're also collecting phone charge. I mean, it's weird and creepy that we're also collecting phone charging data, but the problem is that we're allocating far too many goods and services via the private market. But if we're going to retrieve those things from private market allocation and private market governance, that means that we're no longer allocating them on the basis of a price mechanism and or a credit score. That means that we need some sort of other way to assess like who gets this house. That means that we need public data infrastructure to be like, who needs the house? That's like a thing. That's like a public data infrastructure that we need in order to allocate the house. Because we're not doing a price mechanism anymore. We need another information signal. Anyway, could go on forever about that.
There is a prominent proposal in the US to put credit scoring in the hand of a public agency and take it out of what we call the big three, which are the big three credit reporting agencies. I mean, I don't know that it has any legs, but it's a well-known prominent proposal because of many of the problems that Salome is talking about. And also occasionally there are legislative proposals to ban the use of credit scores for housing access, to ban it for employment access. But the reality is the data brokers that put together tenant screening and employment screening reports will find something else if credit scoring is banned,
they'll find a workaround. I mean,
Yeah.
then they'll just start they'll look at the underlying information directly. They'll just be like, are they good at charging their phones?
Right. It's also
Whatever.
like what kind of phone you have. So people with Apple phones are deemed
Exactly.
more creditworthy than people with Android phones because of, you know, the populations that have them. I mean, it's quite granular.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a
Yeah,
good
just a
question from
second.
Anand.
What was Anand's question?
He said, is the credit score more relational now that it is more datafied than I guess in the analog era when, you know, it was more a matter of accounting?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, again, where do I have? For anyone interested in like social construction and political movements, Sally Haslinger's Resisting Reality, Social Construction and Social Critique lives on my bookshelf. It's my Bible. It's, you know, it's about like, why do we care about these categories of vulnerability? Like, it isn't like, part of what made social credit scores problematic in the past is that they were literally a way of indexing and materializing what it means to be poor. Like, you know, like it's mistaking cause and effect in a way. It's saying like, oh, well, having an iPhone makes you a better credit risk, makes me more likely to give you the thing. It's like, no. Having an iPhone is just a way to materialize and like is a way to like recognize me as in the category of rich or in the category of more likely to be white. Like, so like what are category, like all of these relations are literally constructing social categories of oppression. And we used to largely engage in social category construction in various analog ways. And in an increasingly digital world, we socially construct or we materialize those relations digitally. And that's what I'm concerned about or like interested in. So I think there are probably like more of those relations now that we've datafied them that are materializing like rich person, rich person, rich person, rich person, rich person. But like they're still doing the same thing, which is constructing categories of rich people and poor people, constructing categories of white people and black people, constructing categories of man and woman. And it is like in that construction, in that materialization of those relations of oppression and domination that I think are morally relevant, are politically relevant, and should be legally relevant.
Yeah, and I think what's also important is they're being sold to us as less biased than the old analog ways. This is eliminating the bias and the human prejudices, and that is a false bill of goods.
Totally,
So
totally. And that's a
shift.
huge thing. I think like when people are like, oh, the old way that we did automotive loans was racist. Here's my new way where I just like pay everyone to let me follow their location data and their car forever. And that like isn't the old way we did it, which is racist. And it's like, well, why do you think it was racist? It's because it's materializing social facts about the world that structure racial oppression. And that's going to be rematerialized in the datafied context. So that's why I talk about analog relations, datafied relations. Like the relations of oppression are what made the old version racist. And if we're not going to address those relations of oppression, the datafied versions are just going to rematerialize those relations of oppression.
I feel almost cruel by asking this question. This has been a really empowering, wonderful conversation, but I owe this answer to my students. I promised them that
Sure, yeah.
about this. And you actually brought up the possibility of New York City mandating API information from Uber.
Mhm.
In my class, it came up that in Austin, they had raised the bar of what kinds of background checks would need to be done in order for Lyft and Uber to operate in Austin. And Uber and Lyft just said, you know, this is too expensive. We're not going to do this. And so they opted out, during which period, maybe for around 18 months, maybe less than that, actual taxi drivers created their own app, and other lesser companies came in. They used Facebook pages, and it was sort of like this, you know, great moment that most people were pretty satisfied with. But all that time, Uber and Lyft were lobbying the Texas state legislature. And now Austin no longer controls anything to do with taxis in
Yeah.
city limits. So I don't know if you are thinking about data governance in those terms, like how to get out of this way of gaming the system through lobbying, which of course, you know, I know you don't know every answer to that, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. Maybe you even know the example.
Hmm. Yeah, only because my partner works on smart cities and stuff, so it's like all over that example. So yeah, I mean, you know, I guess I'll give like a weak sauce version of a response, which is like, I'm a data governance scholar, not to say that like the law isn't besieged by problems of like co-optation and anti-democratic capture on every level and on every front. I mean, you know, this is an all fronts kind of a situation. I'm sort of taking a narrow slice of it. We need to probably do a lot about our First Amendment jurisprudence. We probably need to do a lot about the strategic ways in which we deploy home rule or not. So that Austin, that's a classic example of like Dillon's rule versus home rule theories of local governance law. So, you know, I mean, clearly, I don't think that we'll create a panacea in data governance law that solves all of the sort of myriad legal challenges that we face. I mean, probably we need to be doing a whole lot needs to be done about recognizing drivers as employees, not independent contractors. And like, that's just like an employment and labor law question. It's like really not a data governance question. This is all about like whether or not we allow lobbying of state officials, or we find that like as an instance of corruption, which in various instances and places and times in the world we did. Like, we probably should do that too. So that's kind of my cop-out answer.
Not at all.
Yeah. But I do think, I mean, it raises a potentially interesting question, which is to say, you know, and actually an Australian colleague of mine, Jake Goldenfein, has written about this. My glib little API answer does raise a potential concern, which is like kind of a locked in relationship with these gig. If we grant the legal right for the API with Uber, do we potentially foreclose the ability or like the possibility of like a genuinely cooperative you know, driver owned alternative from emerging, because we've kind of created a like parasitic state relationship with the private company. And, you know, that's something that glib example potentially does raise and is a real problem. You know, if we kind of enter into a Fordist era compact between like a state welfare and these large companies, and we just kind of agree to work with one another, are we kind of foreclosing genuinely more like radical cooperative alternatives? And, you know, that's certainly something that I wouldn't want to do or inadvertently foreclose. So taking your example in a different and potentially problematic direction, like I think that's certainly something that you have to be mindful of when you're sort of operationalizing these legal interests.
Yeah. Wow, what a wonderful discussion. And Salome, we have kept you and Michelle at it for quite some time. So I think it's, you are owed, I don't know if anybody minds on revealing themselves for the recording, just for a round of virtual applause, but if not, just please join me. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Salome.
Thank you, audience, for the great questions and just
Yeah.
being here to engage.
Yeah, thank you so much to all. I know it's like crazy hours in some places, so thank you for all of you who've stuck around, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Michelle, and thank you so much, Lauren, for having me and
My
engaging with me.
pleasure. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I hope it's not the last time. Thank you again, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Lauren. Have a good